issue in my previous company some time back, whereas we had some 6 to 7 expats in Gurgaon, and suddenly all of them have got notices to submit their ITR copy, and suddenly they've started sending messages, calling to my phone. So I was a little panicked that time, and I had to literally reach out to all the possible resources to find out what happened suddenly. So this is something which has triggered from Gurgaon, and slowly but surely it will touch all the other cities. And the third challenge usually that I see is there is no uniformity of registration process across India. So the FRRO process in Mumbai takes, for example, 60 days. The same thing in Kolkata will be done in 2 weeks. So there is no uniformity, and also this is one of the reasons why the HR advisors will not be able to brief the expats what is the actual time period. And in terms of extensions also, extensions or renewals, there have been questions raised in terms of producing the tax ITR copies as well as tax challans. So there are, I mean, we usually deal with high-level people and getting rid of their tax returns, because they will not have time to do all this. So that is again a big challenge, because when you are dealing with high-profile people like VPs or CEOs or CFOs. So again, this will pose a big challenge in my view.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Datta. So in fact, in Bangalore, we have seen another requirement which is not there in other locations, is when a foreign national comes towards the end of the tax year, so sometimes in the month of Feb or March, sometimes in the month of April, and a tax return copy is not available because the person would have just started working, they put an endorsement on the residence permit saying ITRV and Form 16 to be furnished by such and such date. If that is not done, then the foreign national is not allowed to leave India. So if he or she wants to travel for some purpose, they need to get that endorsement removed, and they need to travel post that. If they cannot furnish that for any reason, say suppose, as we discussed yesterday, they've claimed a treaty exemption, they were not taxable in India, it takes a lot of effort to explain this to the FRR authorities and get that endorsement removed. So this is one thing which we've seen happening a lot in Bangalore. Now Gurgaon has also made it mandatory to get an ITCC issued from the tax authorities. So very soon it's going to spread across India.
Okay, and g'day everyone. We've almost made it. You've done well. 15 minutes to go about. Now, now I just wanted to quickly talk about a couple of observations in the region, really, because Australasia, that is such a diverse, huge region with very, very diverse countries. And it's enough to say you've got some very sophisticated immigration departments across some countries, like in Australia and Singapore. You've got very unsophisticated immigration departments in others, like in Cambodia, Timor, and you've got ones in the middle, like Indonesia, Vietnam, and they all have very different opinions on what's allowed on, especially business visitor visas. So all I could suggest to everybody is that they closely check what people are doing before saying a business visitor is okay. Like, you know, an easy example is somebody going to a conference like this, or speaking at a conference especially. If I was going to speak at a conference in most countries across the region, a business visitor is fine, but for whatever reason, the Australian government deemed this to be work. So you need to have a short-term work permit, the 400 visa. So it's very important just to check what these people are doing and what is actually allowed in each country, because you just can't assume what's allowed in one country is permitted in the other. So that's really important. And the second thing, which I'd quickly like to say, is we always like to give everybody in the audience a nice takeaway, and I think this is a nice takeaway. If you've got colleagues working in Asian countries, in Australia and in New Zealand, they may be eligible for what's called an APAC card. An APAC card is awesome. So if you're traveling in Australasia and you're eligible for an APAC card, it's valid for up to 5 years, depending on what country you're residing in, and then it negates the need to apply for a business visa for those countries for that period of the APAC validity. APEC card validity. I've got one and I love it. It means I don't have to apply for a visa to go to China every time. I don't have to apply for a visa to go to Vietnam. I don't have to apply to a visa to go to Indonesia. It's great. Obviously, you can only do what's permitted as a business visitor visa, but if you have one, it's just my favourite thing in my wallet at the moment. It means you actually jump to the front of the queue at the airport and you save a lot of money with having to worry about filing for visas across the region.
Good. Thanks, Tim. So we talked about US, we talked about UK and Australia. So how about the rest of the countries in Asia? So you see, Asia is always an emerging market, and you see, except some countries like Singapore or Australia, so most of the countries are still not attracting most of the expat population. So, but they are making their attempts to make it attractive, giving them lesser stringent immigration rules and also attractive packages, good projects to work upon. So some of the couple of updates in the latest immigration scenarios for some of the countries is that for Singapore, I know you would have read somewhere that the fixed minimum salary for employment pass is going to increase from 3,300 Singapore dollars to $3,600 effective Jan 1st coming year. But it's going to be mandated from July 1st onwards next year. The initial 6 months period for the people who are already there on assignment in Singapore, they will have to renew it with the revised fees. And in terms of for Thailand, the visa on arrival, they have revised the fees again from 1,000 Thai bahts to 2,000 Thai bahts, which is effective from last September. And apart from that, I keep hearing challenges about mainland Chinese expats entering into Vietnam on a business trip especially. So I kept hovering like, why, what is the challenge? So then the main challenge for people from mainland China is that while they board the Chinese airlines, they have to have the visa stamped fully. Though there is a visa on arrival for people who are out of non-mainland China. Either we usually propose for the business travelers into Vietnam, if they are going from mainland China, that you get it done, you get the visa stamped in the the airport itself before departure, or you move into a non-mainland China and take the flight from there, be it from Hong Kong or somewhere. So that is one challenge which we keep getting, because business or the management always thinks that getting a business visa is easy. But there are a few restrictions for some of the countries like China. The other one is on the rescheduling interview process for Philippines. So earlier, the interview process along with the biometrics happens on the same day. But because of any circumstances, if it cannot happen on the same day, the candidate has to notify the Immigration Bureau of Philippines and a division called ARD, Alien Registration Department. So that is where he has to pay a fees of 2,000 Philippine peso to make sure that he gets the appointment in the next slot available. And last but not least, the Malaysian immigration has mandated it that medical registration for most of the countries in Asia Pacific who are coming into Malaysia has been mandated. Earlier, there was a cushion that they can land in Malaysia and then go for medical checkups, but now they have to complete the medical checkups before the departure and then land in Malaysia, and this includes India as well.
Yeah, and one observation I'd like to make too is that it's clear across the region, as in Europe and the US, governments are looking more closely at work permits or employment visas than ever before, and that trend is not going to change. If anything, it's going to increase. So due diligence is very important. And so when somebody will say, like it always gets me when somebody will say, oh, we've got a visa into Indonesia and only took 2 days. That's because there's basically brown paper bags going underneath tables. So corruption is rampant, unfortunately, still in some of these locations. And I'm sure no one in this room would ever consider to do such an activity, but we do need to explain what the usual process is to senior management. And if you have an audit committee as part of your company, maybe they should be aware as well. Because when you hear your competitors can get somebody in 2 days, they're not doing it in a legitimate way. But being positive, well, I'll give you a positive thing for a minute. If anyone applying for 400 visas in India, it's all about to go electronic, so you don't have to use VFS from 19th November. Happy days.
Tim, would you like to answer the questions which we have in front of us?
Sure. Is it hard or easy to get the Australian work permit? That's almost like saying how long is a piece of string, but it really depends on obviously your occupation, your company status. If your company is an existing Australian business sponsor and they want to transfer you to Australia in a gazetted occupation, receiving an acceptable salary, it's quite straightforward. But if your company isn't already an approved sponsor, then it can get quite complex. But the one good thing about Australia, which is quite rare in the world of global immigration, is you don't necessarily have to have an entity operating in Australia to sponsor to Australia. So you could have a business operating in Bangalore, they've just won a contract to service whatever in Australia, and you need to send a couple of IT engineers. The company here can apply for what's called overseas business sponsorship, then they can sponsor people to Australia on the 457 visa to fulfill contractual obligations. Obviously it depends on minimum wages being met, etc., but it's definitely doable, and that's a very positive aspect about Australian immigration. Any particular salary details to get an Australian work permit? Well, for that one there isn't a minimum, but you have to take the minimum with a grain of salt because there is also the prevailing wage for that particular occupation. So if the prevailing wage is 80,000, that's the minimum you have to pay. So every occupation will differ. Throw some light on training benchmarks. Training benchmarks is part of becoming a business sponsor. So at the moment, there's 2 ways to satisfy the training benchmark in Australia, and this is only for companies who've been operating in Australia for more than 12 months. So when I mentioned if you're a company operating in Bangalore with no Australian operations, then the training benchmark is not relevant. But if you do have an Australian operation operating for more than 12 months, you either have to spend 1% of your Australian payroll on eligible training of Australian staff, and you wouldn't really want to do this one, or you donate 2% of your Australian payroll to an eligible training organisation. So they're currently the 2 ways to meet the training benchmark. There's rumours that it's going to change, so keep a lookout for that, because the government made an announcement last year that it would change, but as yet is the status quo.
Thanks, Tim.
Panel, that's been a great pleasure to hear your great knowledge, and we thank you for sharing with us on the Australasia topic, and for all these important issues you brought to the table. Thank you very much. Come forward and receive your trophies.